I ran an extra 200 gallons of solvent over it to make sure I got the last 1 gram.
Right.
Well, did you factor in that taking that 200 gallons, turning it into a vapor using heat, and then recovering it doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're fighting for pennies now, like A, it's time. B, there's electrical costs. Maybe if you're using liquid CO2, that's another cost to recondense it. Right. And so like that cost adds up. Yes, you're not losing the solvent, but you are having to recover it. Right. And these are kind of just some of the simple like process optimization techniques that like Exxon and like these large companies like implement.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we've got a very special episode, just Kellen and I. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to just chat with you for the next hour. I think we have a lot of interesting things to talk about. How are you, Brad?
You know, thinking about it before we did this is kind of like weird. We're kind of going full circle. When we first started, it was just you and me. And then we went through 250 episode stretch where we had guests. And now kind of going back to the roots, just the two of us.
Yeah, it's interesting because like at first our first guest I was so nervous for, right? And then after like 100, you just kind of get used to it. And now like, again, we're going back to the two of us. And I was like, I'm actually a little more nervous about this episode than like having a stranger on.
Yeah, no, I felt the same exact way. I showed up and I was like, I wonder what we're going to talk about. And then I realized we came back from Benzinga. We got a ton of information. And I think like at a certain point, we've had so many conversations, Kellen, just privately with individuals, with leaders of the industry, that there was some information that we were hearing that it makes me wonder, should we share it? Should we not share it? Especially given the fact of like what is going to transform from an industry. So high level summary from Benzinga. Did you enjoy it? What was the number one takeaway you had from it?
I enjoyed it. I think high level takeaway is it continues to be the conference that has the right people in the right place all at once. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think there's not a single conference that I think can compete with it. I've been pretty loud of my opinions of expos and conferences, and from a marketing standpoint, that I don't think a lot of them are worth anything. I think they're just lighting cash on fire. I mean, every year we go to MJ Biz and I just vomit at what we're seeing and just wondering what it spends. And if anyone has any understanding of if it's translating to sales or awareness or whatever they're trying to accomplish. And Benzinga for me continues to be the number one of one show. The decision makers are there. The ability to connect with individuals are there. The information that is shared is super paramount. And you can really get a good perspective for people's headspaces. In some years, there's been massive optimism. In other years, there's been a little downtrodden. This year, I felt like it was a little bit in between. And I'm wondering if you felt that way also. So I'll give a quick example of what one of the conversations we had was that there was a lot of warning signs going forward that right now on June 17th, things are bad and they're likely about to get way, way worse. And unfortunately, that is probably the reality. And I think you've mentioned the shakeout, right? This is not just like small companies, but they're big companies that are in some challenging situations and you're going to have to figure out how to flip the script pretty quick.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a culling of the herd event that's going on. And I mean, also on top of that, for example, I rode the elevator with two unique consultants that, I mean, we've been going to Benzinga for a while and I never have ridden the elevator or met a consultant that specializes in receiverships, right? And so I got two business cards about receivership consultants, which kind of tells you tale of the tape right now, what's going on in the industry.
Yeah, that's a horrible sign. I think one conversation that really sparked me was that there's a large scale company that is super healthy, that is doing really good, is one of the premier ones that everyone knows, and they're taking a kind of a de-risking or diversification of the customers that they work with. And I found that strategy so interesting, right? Is here's a company that's doing really good. And instead of kind of over leveraging their relationships with certain other companies, they're kind of tightening up and saying, okay, like we should do business with smaller companies and more of them instead of just leading it all in one. And I wonder if that's more of like a domino causation effect, being fearful of if two other companies go out of business and some guy gets caught and then we're all caught up in a certain state. Do you think that's the approach they're taking? Or do you think it's more of just like, right now, we're not really sure what's going on. So we're going to kind of split up our bets across the table?
I think there's a lot of bets going on, but I think that like a lot of people right now are trying to do like maybe like the 80-20 rule where like 80% of revenue is generated from 20%. And they're kind of just leaning into their really strong relationships, right? And trying to like figure out what other relationships they need to get rid of and kind of balancing that whole act, right? And in all honesty, like a lot of companies there are companies doing well, right? That have like good relationships. They haven't really expanded. They kind of focused on some of their core competencies. There are just not a lot of them, right? And I would say the majority of the industry has kind of like placed a lot of different bets that just maybe haven't panned out as intended or because of like political headwinds. I mean, like the hemp thing was a huge topic, right? If you want to get into that.
Before we get into that, though, I wanna bring up one of my favorite quotes that you've said over at nauseum is like vertical integration, right? If done the right way, massive amount of margins, really beneficial. But if done incorrectly or poorly put together, or just in normal sense, highly challenging. You're running 6 or 7 different businesses, all stacked on top of each other, all need to be interwoven and deeply thorough with their understanding, and even more complicated. There are no sort of like economies of scale because that vertical integration is only core critical in a certain state and doesn't really apply to any other state. So if you have specialization, which is nearly impossible, you don't even get that sort of like rollover effects in other states because it doesn't really transfer. And I think what we're starting to see now from an industry standpoint is that stacking all those businesses on top of each other has just led to a fact that they built the house really fast and they don't have really good layers. Nobody's really exactly sure what they do best in. And because of that, they've got all these challenges across their supply chain. And now they don't have a strong enough business relationship or organization to handle these challenging times because they're not sure exactly where their problem is because they have got problems in every different layer of the house.
And again, MSOs are also kind of feeling the brunt of this because like you may have like 14 different like facilities across 14 different states, but they're not rowing together, right? Because like state A and state B have completely different regulations. So then when they get together to like communicate, they're like, well, we have to go this way because XYZ. And they're like, well, we don't have XYZ, so we go this way. Right. And so now you have even more isolated entities that aren't rowing together. Right. And that's just one example. But like the fragmentation has really hurt the industry, I think. And especially like the growth at all costs. It's just kind of like you're up a river without a paddle at this point almost, you know?
So how is this going to shake out, right? Because at a certain point, teams are going to be like, okay, like we don't make any money in processing. We should offload processing, or cultivation. We're not doing so good. We should offload. You think it's just going to become like a shakeout fest where like teams continue to look inwards and go, okay, specialization. What do we do better than everyone else? What should we outsource to have one less problem in supply chain? Or do you think it'll be something else?
No, I think specialization is probably the only way forward for a lot of these organizations. And like, there's a lot of good teams out there, right? And they're good at certain aspects, but they're just spread too thin. And you'll see like a lot of these like at least sophisticated organizations will like look at the data and they'll start to do some self-reflection and they'll analyze what pieces of their businesses aren't making money and which ones are. And like, they'll clean it up, but it's going to be painful, right? Like it's no longer growth and like cutting jobs and cutting departments isn't easy. But like the good ones will do that and they'll survive, in my opinion.
Yeah, and those are like the bad PR headlines, right? Everyone takes like those headlines and runs with them that it's doomsday. But unfortunately, like we talked about, things have to get worse before they get better, and those are hard decisions, right? At the end of the day, those are really hard decisions because, like you said, those are jobs, those are personnel, those are assets, those are expenses, and financially, they're just going to need to be continuation of like figuring out like where they do better things than else. And I wonder like where that is because. From one of the things we're hearing was that teams were meeting strategically is like figuring out more often about, okay, we got to tighten this up. We got to look here. And I appreciate all that, right? Is like they're taking a more inwards approach and not as like, we got to do it every month or every quarter. This is a weekly review of like, how do we tighten things up? How do we get things better? And I think this is the bell warning signs, right? If you could just think from an alarm standpoint of like, this is an internal sound of like, if we don't figure things out soon, things are going to get worse. And we don't know how much worse we can take them because we don't know how much longer we can operate like this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think like a sign of like a market maturing is like initially when it goes online, the license itself can be just a piece of paper can be worth $1 million, right? Then you watch the industry mature. Now the licenses you can't even give them away in Michigan, right? Like here's a piece of property with a license and it's still challenging to like offload that asset. So it just shows you like at first it's really lucrative, and then things kind of really, really tighten up quickly in these industries or these markets, if you will.
Yeah, faster than I think people realize. And I think we were seeing some of those trends, right? I think some of the trends we'll talk about in a little bit was maybe originally just a California trend. And I think, what was a California trend early in January is now, if you don't have it in June or by the end of this year, you probably don't have a chance at certain aspects of the supply chain. And that's just the time for the cause, right? It is what it is at this point now. Is like everyone's leveling up their game. They're figuring out, okay, where are we weakest and where can we figure out how to patch these holes, really patch these holes? Because if we don't fix them now, it'll probably kill us when we have to go head to toe in early 2026. So the one area that we should quickly talk about, though, is the situation in Texas. I don't know if you want to set that up. Just trying to hear and grasp what's going on with such a wild concept of trying to make sense of it all, right? We all recognize how critical of a vote it is, but maybe you can tee it up and try to set the stage and help people understand just what's going on and how critical this is.
Yeah, so I think for those that don't know, there was a bill passed in Texas that bans intoxicating hemp, right? That has passed, and it's now up to the governor to veto or not. I think he maybe has a couple days left now at this point. 5 days left?
June 22nd.
Yeah, June 22nd. And if he vetoes it, the hemp industry can continue making intoxicating cannabinoids. This includes a lot of the D9 beverages now. That's a part of the supply chain. It's based in Texas, right? They're responsible for a lot of the conversions and infusions for the beverages and a much larger industry at play right now across the United States because, of course, they don't have the same regulations as the cannabis industry, which is an interesting conversation in and of itself, but we won't get into that. And I guess there's a lot of political headwind because the governor he's in between a rock and a hard place, I guess. And it also has potential implications at a federal level, we're hearing, right? Because there's Trump representatives in Austin also trying to influence the outcome of
You're saying a major Republican state is being influenced by the potential leader of the free world.
Yeah, exactly, right.
Well, this is where things get super wild, right? So if things take a turn, then what could potentially happen fast is what? Rescheduling? You think that's the move that Trump could potentially take?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Does that make the playing ground even? But I would think that that would maybe occur, right?
So they would veto the bill in the 22nd of June, and Trump would come over the top a week or two later, hypothetically, and just reschedule. And then what do we just have? Just pure chaos for a month or two?
Yeah, I also read a random headline that they could close the loophole as well from a federal standpoint even if they veto it. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of potential different outcomes.
This is the part of the industry that's so hard to keep track of because you can take 3 days off of following everything and come back and be I have no idea how someone who's running one of these businesses can potentially build out a scenario or forecasting out their business with all of these variables in the pipeline with just massive implications. And maybe there's an easier approach that is way cleaner, but in my mind, if I was one of these C-suite, this is the type of stuff that would keep me up at night being okay, are we prepared for this? Because, the dominoes when they fall, which we all continue to dream about. And Jesse did a great job of kind of talking about that optimism, which you're right. We might sometimes be too optimistic, but I think about that, right? Because there will be a day when this optimistic approach that we've had is reality. And maybe that day is sooner rather than later. And as an eternal optimist, I would love to have that, before the end of 2026.
It'll be really interesting to see how the whole thing kind of plays out. And it's tough, right? You have two very different scenario planning, outcomes, right? In terms of the structure of your business, right? I think at just a macro level right now, it's just an economy of scales, right? If the hemp industry can continue to manufacture these derivative products, they can just outcompete any cannabis company that's limited by state lines.
The economies of scale is a real thing. That is a real thing.
Right?
It's a real
canopy limits for cannabis in states. You can grow 100,000 acres of hemp. Right? It's not even what are we doing?
Yeah, and the distribution aspect, again, the
hub and spoke model, baby. Just same thing, Budweiser and Coca-Cola.
Yeah, turns out that's not the first play, right? We didn't make
You can order it on the internet right now. That's the crazy thing.
Edibles.com. Shout out Thomas, right?
Yeah, let's go.
Sending you a bill for that one.
Looking
Thomas.
forward to having him on the pod.
Yeah, that's a bill. You're getting an invoice for that one. So one of the other areas of that Texas thing, I mean, I don't even know. We'll have some good episodes coming up on that
gossip,
one.
You know?
Yeah, that one's some good gossip. And like, I didn't even know when we were getting told that. I was like, I don't even know if I'm understanding what he's saying right now. Like, this is wild. And we'll have some good episodes coming up at the end of the month on this topic and try to make sense of it, because like, I need a better understanding. I don't understand enough. It's way too confusing for me. And like, each day there's like a new change, a new main character telling me like one thing or the other. And I still like can't figure it out. So we'll definitely have to dive into that. One other area that really caught my eye at Benzinga, and I wonder if you saw this too, Kellen, was that over the last like 6 to 8 months, we've seen people like Tyler working with inventory and tightening all those elements up, right? Really understanding from a forecasting standpoint what you need and then working backwards through that, really understanding how to reduce the amount of inventory that's kind of flowing through the system. Shout out Tyler. And then you've seen like the cultivation side where everyone's got the sensors and understanding, okay, growing a plant, we've been doing this for hundreds of years. We can utilize Big Ag's best practices and really dialing those in. Everyone's really pushing for sensors and for cultivation and really getting their numbers down. And finally, they have realized that they've got both ends of the spectrum and that there's one key part of the supply chain that maybe, just maybe, is critical and is leaking pretty bad. And now it's time to get visibility in. Did you hear those same things? And if you did it surprise you kind of like it's taken this long to come to this point?
I did hear those same things. And I think that like another driving force behind that is like you see this continued increase in total market share of like the derivative products, right? Like infused pre-rolls, vape pens, edibles, beverages, right? This now makes up like 60% of the total addressable market from a product SKU perspective. And so now like sophisticated groups are looking at the data and they're seeing these trends. And now they're like, oh, wow, like this whole box where we put this kid with a bunch of explosive solvents is kind of a really important part of our business now because it's responsible for this massive product SKU that continues to show growth, right? In the industry that's kind of been clamped down from a growth perspective. And so I think that is also like a driving force behind like the growing interest in trying to like figure out what's going on in that box, if you will, right?
Yeah, it's such a critical portion of the puzzle and one that is so challenging. And I think from my standpoint, it is the widest disparity between the teams, right? We've spoken to a ton of different teams now. And the way I think about it is like maybe like 3 or 4 different buckets, right? You've got the current approach by many, which is the artisanal approach with the flashlight and the handwritten notes, which I love to just hit into the ground, right? And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your fully automated extraction system dialed in with real-time sensors and all these decision makings that are removed from the operator's hand. So you've replaced the flashlight with a sensor and all of this artisanal approach is removed and kind of automated with the system. And then there's everybody in between. And as we've kind of pushed this further and further, it no longer makes sense, in my opinion, how teams can honestly look at themselves and say, okay, we've got a manual approach that maybe worked for the last 5 or 6 years that work today. But in the next 6 months, when everyone's really tightening up and your competitors are all using automated systems with real-time sensors, how can you compete? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. There's a full spectrum of like processors in the industry. If you feel like the
I see. Well, so I guess why, right? You're someone who is as well versed in extraction as there is in the industry.
I think honestly, it's very like straightforward, right? Like we talked about this at Benzinga actually, right? Like just because you're good at science doesn't mean you have a business, right? And like a lot of these companies that are doing extraction now are good at business. They have good sales. They've managed their expenses, right? They're still around currently, right? They got licensing, right? They did a lot of other aspects of running a business well, right? And so I think that that's part of the puzzle in terms of why you have this huge spectrum of companies, right? Because there's a lot of companies that do all the other aspects well from running a business, like keeping the lights on, if you will, right? And they just are like, hey, it's a black box and I just manage it from a 50,000 foot level, right? Things go in, things come out. It just is what it is, right? Like we pull other levers in our business to try to try to make more money, right? Like I try to get the things I put in for less money, right?
Sure, but you don't know. That's the problem though. Is like from a cost aggregation standpoint, right? You're using handwritten notes. Sure, how helpful could that be? I mean,
And this is the growing pains, right? Like,
sure, but
I think Exxon never didn't start producing petroleum products through distillation, right? At first with like a hyper focus on every different fraction and like how that fraction then relates to commodity pricing in the wholesale market, right? Didn't start there, right? But that technology does exist now, right? So like we don't need to like reinvent fire. Right?
I know. My favorite is when people ask how long this technology that we're talking about exists, and how long would you say?
It's been mandated by the FDA in pharmaceutical manufacturing, I think, since 2001. So mandated in pharmaceutical manufacturing for 25 plus years.
Just the idea that somebody can look through a tiny ass sight glass with a flashlight to make a decision, a key critical decision, blows my mind still. Since the moment I got in the industry, it's blown my mind even more so now. And the fact that a solution exists to replace that, to improve the decision-making process by replacing that tiny ass sight glass with a flashlight with a sensor that can manage components in real time for real visibility. It's no longer like a game changer, right? It is a necessary standard in order to compete, because what we saw was early this year, it was California pretty much only, right? It was like not a lot of margin. So having the need for visibility in real time, super, super critical. And I would say even in February, it was still like, no, we're good here. Our numbers are good. We've got our SOPs. Benzinga was eye-opening for me because teams are aggressively pushing this forward because they're realizing now that their competitors are doing this. And if they don't have a solution to compete, they don't have a chance. They don't have a chance at all.
Yeah, with margins, it's a race to the bottom, right? And you've seen this on the West Coast, especially as these markets mature. And it's a race to the bottom, and every penny counts, right? And then if you're wasting even 20, 30 minutes in some of these manufacturing facilities, that can change your margins significantly.
Massive. And then it's even harder too, because the incoming material is a plant. You're likely not logging enough of the data parameters from an operational standpoint to be able to track which of the key parameters is influencing the yield. And then everything kind of gets mapped through a Google sheet where it's color coded based on performance, but without the ability to kind of read through the data and understand why did this batch successful versus
and
that.
I think honestly, one of the, and sorry to interrupt, but I think one of the reasons that currently exists right now is because of the track and trace program, right? This is this is a negative side effect associated with it.
Not the same data.
It had a good intention, right? Track and trace, we want to prevent stuff going out the back door, but also it's a framework for managing all of the data. But it just wasn't delivered properly, and it just became a massive chore for these companies, right? And so now you're forcing all these people to record all of this information, and then no one's using that information for anything.
But compliance data is not operational.
Has a massive database of data that no one that's recording the data, at least from my knowledge, is actively utilizing that to optimize their process.
But is it the same data though? Is it the same critical data parameters and metrics not tracking temperature and pressure in the extraction system?
No, it's not doing those things, but it does. It's supposed to track yield, right? You have material in, you have oil out, and waste. So you can see yield differences.
Metrics goal though is compliance.
Compliance,
driven.
Yeah.
Right.
So people got distracted by compliance, and then they now are
mixing it all together.
They're not using data for optimization because they're just it's a chore that I have to do, and I'm just over it at this point.
Why don't you give a quick synopsis on the different critical components that go into extraction, and how if you don't understand these thermodynamics that are going on, you are pretty much guessing throughout the entire process.
I mean, there's a lot of different extraction methods, right? And so they all have their different
you start with hydrocarbon just as
critical parameter. I mean, hydrocarbon's simple right now because there's not a lot of levers for people to pull, right? Temperature and pressure are critical, right? In thermodynamics, there's a critical law, PV equals nRT, right? These two are related. So record pressure and temperature and the volume of sulfur that's being utilized, and that'll dictate everything. CO2, also temperature, pressure. hyper important. This dictates like what state the CO2 is in, right? So you do supercritical CO2 extraction. That is because at a certain temperature and pressure, CO2 changes its densities and has a different phase, right? And then with ethanol, right, most of the cannabis industry practices what's called cryogenic ethanol extraction, right? Because at colder temperatures, you don't extract a lot of the sugars and gums, right? So then when you go to remove the solvent from the stuff you got off the biomass, right, you don't have any of those sugars and gums present, and it doesn't clog up your distillation equipment, right? If you do a warm extraction, you have to do something that's called degumming, right? And this is done in the palm oil industry. A lot of practices that are executed on a industrial process within the cannabis space or sub-industrial pilot process scale are directly pulled from like the palm oil industry, right? Like winterization, the term is a term that was directly derived from winterizing palm oil, right? And so all of these processes is what I'm saying have been like a lot of them aren't unique to cannabis. I think honestly, what is unique to cannabis is hydrocarbon extraction, right? I think that one has like a unique place, especially from like a terpene capture standpoint, right? I know that like that just isn't executed on an industrial scale really anywhere else, right?
But the core components though of hydrocarbon, temperature, pressure, understanding these system conditions are critical still, right? Like at the end of the day, maybe it's unique for cannabis, but at the core foundation of it.
You're still doing
right. And that's I think that's the point of it. And I think now is like the perfect time for us to kind of introduce like what we've been working on, right? Because I think we've kind of hinted at it for a few years now. Podcasting is just the front. And unfortunately, this front now is exposed. So we can come clean with the truth, which is I'll give you the opportunity, or you want me to do it. All right. So for us, we've been working on what's called Newton Insights. It's the ability to monitor THC in real time. And to meet teams where they are, we've introduced a sensor that plumbs into your hydrocarbon system and allows you to digitally track all those parameters, all mirrored through with our AI-generated system that allows you to make real-time decisions and cost control. And I think the beauty of it is the simplicity on how easy it is to use, because the way we've worked with these teams, we've recognized that we can't adjust operators' workflow starting. The best way to start is to integrate the sensor inside and just let it run in the background and let teams do what they normally are and logging the data digitally. And I'll let you speak on the AI components, because I think this is the aspect where as teams go forward, they recognize we've got endless data and we want to actionize it, but how to do that is really challenging.
Yeah. And I think that like it kind of touches on what we were talking about with compliance data. A lot of people are just overwhelmed with data and they kind of just, tons of organizations, everyone records a crazy amount of information. Like everyone records a wild amount of information and then they just put it in a filing cabinet.
Or go
right? And they're like, maybe one day we'll hire a data scientist. That's like how it's dealt with, right? And so like
problem for another day.
It is a really tall task to like go in, parse, clean all this data, feed it into like a traditional like Power BI system, right? A lot of these companies, it would be a full team and probably take them months to have an expert team come in, clean it, plug it in. And like, this is the benefit of like LLMs now and like AI, if you will, is that they have the capability to condense that work into seconds that would take months and months and months before, right? And so like, I think the most impactful thing a lot of these organizations can do is they've been doing this for a long time. And like looking back over a decade of information is really challenging to pull correlations out.
Right.
When it is maybe at best case, it's 10 Excel documents that recorded an entire year and each sheet is 1 month, right? Like that's best case scenario. And it's hyper organized. It's still going to be really, really challenging to like pull up these 10 massive documents and be like, okay, let me compare how I did this OG in June 2018 to June 2023. And like, was it the same? Like you just not like, the task is going to be way too great for the benefit that you're going to get from that task.
For sure.
What I mean?
So why not give them like a quick explanation on like the benefits of the project we're working on and why kind of it grows with you, right? Because the more you utilize the different tools and aggregate the data inside the platform, the more visibility you can get into real time to make those better decisions.
Yeah. So the platform, we have our own LLM that we built into it that has been fine tuned on an insane amount of data that I've curated personally over the last 10 years being in the industry as a curious scientist. And so what that does is it gives you the capability to instantly upload your data to the platform and inquire the LLM to parse the data and compare it to what you're currently doing. Right. And I think that this is really powerful for like getting to the root decision-making information to then move forward. Right. I think a lot of times people get bogged down in just like trying to come up with what the data is actually meaning. And realistically, what is needed is you just need the meaning to help you make decisions.
No, I think that's so powerful. And I think just given the speed of the way everyone's operating and the fact that everyone's looking inwards to cut costs, like this is the ability to do that more effectively versus like wondering, hey, maybe we change this or we change this. Or my favorite one is like, we'll just go find cheaper biomass. And at a certain point, like that lever can only be pulled so many times. After that, it's how do you compete and how do you do better? And I think this is when we were talking about like the wide disparity of different teams is that you've got that artisanal approach that currently worked for 5 or 6 years. And one of my favorite quotes was from Rob of Mock, shout out Rob, when he was talking about the fact of like, before the diesel engine car, people were on their horses and they were like, well, our horse works great. Why would I want to upgrade to a car? And it's like, well, dude, like in a race, this is the competition now. And you no longer have the ability to use your horse in that same sort of speed. And I think like as the industry moves, which it is an insane speed pace, the time difference between the adoption of technology is expediting because I think there's an urgency to figure out where and how to improve. And without tools and best practices, if you're not doing what everyone else is doing from a best practice standpoint, you really don't have a chance.
Yeah. And honestly, to like piggyback on what you just said, it's like, you think about the assembly line, right? This is, I think, perfect analogy, right? The assembly line, right? Like, shout out to Ford, right? Like, and the horse in the car, right? But like, the assembly line went from a bunch of humans putting a car together. We optimized that over the course of 50 years. Now, there's not human beings in car manufacturing assembly lines, right? That's not a thing. And so, like, if you are forward looking as an organization, you realize that automated manufacturing is going to benefit the bottom line of the business and make it stronger over the course of its lifetime. That's just how it works, right? You'll get better margins. And if it's a race to the bottom, the margins are going to be much better if you implement automation. The first step in implementing automation is getting the same information that human is gathering to make decisions into a digital format.
Step one.
Right? And I think that is like some of the lowest hanging fruit now, right? It's digitizing the information. And there's been attempts at like fully automating hydrocarbon, right? And I think that one of the biggest obstacles for a lot of that automation right now is that they're kind of like time and recipe based. And the plant is very variable, right? And so like if this plant material has a little more of the API THCA in it and that one has a little less and use the same solvent, you're going to get different results.
Right there, I think is like the problem, right? If a automated system can't be perfect because of the variations of the material, how is an individual with a flashlight supposed to be perfect?
With the sensor, it's going to be, it like measures those so it can adapt in real time versus like you're only going to trust your best operator
right
to like drive it in real time. You know what I mean? I think that's the biggest take home message, right? Is that the sensor can provide the automation, the ability to be like the best operator all the time.
Right. It can raise the floor of the team and allow your newest level employee to deliver 80% of your top employee, which the way I continue to think about it is it helps stabilize the floor and reduce the low yields, because what we've seen is some teams get low yields for a variety of reasons. And, they're not really sure exactly where the problem is or how to fix it. I mean, sometimes they catch it before it hits their bottom line, but others, they only catch it 2 weeks late. And that's way, way, way too down down the line when everyone is getting super tight with all their numbers. You need to have visibility into real time. You need to be able to cost control. You need to be able to understand exactly what's happening so you can make better decisions, not 2 weeks into the future, immediately.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that besides an optimization in terms of trying to change the chemistry of what's going on from that interaction, there's an optimization that goes into traditional manufacturing and traditional equipment use time, right? If it's on, it needs to be making something, right? There's a lot of simple optimization that can occur from just strictly monitoring the use cases, right?
Downtime you're talking about?
Downtime.
Yeah.
And
why don't you explain how the downtime aspect works? I think that's an aspect of the project that
I think the most expensive portion of the process is taking the liquid, turning it into a vapor, and then recondensing it, right?
So when we talk about waste, right, this is the type of waste that I think is not commonly identified as a problem for these
people
teams.
think trash that you're throwing out when they think waste. Not hey, I ran an extra 200 gallons of solvent over it to make sure I got the last 1 gram.
Right.
Well, did you factor in that taking that 200 gallons, turning it into a vapor using heat, and then recovering it doesn't seem like a lot. But when you're fighting for pennies now, A, it's time. B, there's electrical costs. Maybe if you're using liquid CO2, that's another cost to recondense it, right? And so that cost adds up. Yes, you're not losing the solvent, but you are having to recover it, right? And these are kind of just some of the simple process optimization techniques that Exxon and these large companies implement in terms of this is the other side of the coin when you do scale, right? There's these other topics that become more impactful to your organization from a bottom line perspective.
Right. And I don't blame extraction teams, right? I want to understand that, I want to communicate that, I recognize how hard their job is. And I full-heartedly understand that they're getting pulled from both sides. But this type of level of information, it's impossible for them to actually understand what it costs or how damaging it is to their bottom line if they don't use tools, if they're not using this for consideration, because that operator is doing their job based on the KPIs that are set for them or what they think is best. I would assume that most teams are not considering all of these elements, all of it in real time, and how much it affects their bottom line. And this is where, as they continue to look inwards and they're okay, it's a black box, you got to understand all of these elements in real time, which is why waste is probably not the best word to describe it, because the way it continues to be is multiple leaks from a pipe and you're just duct taping left and right trying to figure out hey, let's keep it moving going forward.
Yeah. And there could be a lot more digital simulations and running a lot of these kind of metrics from a traditional engineering perspective, right? It's a lot of free calculators on here.
Yeah, there's a ton of free calculators. And I think, again, as we spoke about, is early on, this was a very California focused tool. This for us, we got a lot of traction early in California, and the East Coast is taking a little while to come on. And my God, it's fast. And the aspect now is not, how quickly can we get one? It's how quickly can we get it in multiple facilities, because we realize how damaging this is, but we're not sure where the problem is or how bad it is. And I think that's one of the aspects from the tool that I've been surprised at. It was one, the hidden waste elements that you were saying from an electricity standpoint, but also the fact that someone can plumb this into their system today and within 15 minutes be getting information that they didn't have access to prior. And it just provides insight into what's happening in real time that before this, they were just hoping everything was working out.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of optimization and making everyone's life easier is just reducing friction points.
Right.
And right now, a lot of organizations are capturing the proper data and people are doing a really good job. They have certain KPIs they have to meet, right? And there's another friction point that is just the busy work that grinds on you, right? Where it's I write this down on a piece of paper, then I have to take this and I upload it into an Excel document. And then maybe on a Saturday, I don't get to go out because I have to compile the Excel document once a month and create a report. And that's a lot of time that's taken away from the business that you guys could be improving, creating new products, doing other more beneficial things for the business when there's a platform now that you can just does all of that instantaneously, right? And it just gives people all this time back and helps just streamline the organization from an employee function perspective too, right? People aren't just doing busy work anymore.
That's a great point, right? Like some of the aspects I think are really damaging is that things are moving so fast and people just are in roles that they were originally in. But as tools advance, especially with AI, right? Like there's ability to streamline some of these operations, and change is hard. At the end of the day, change is for sure really, really difficult, especially at the speed that the industry is moving in. But the one challenge I continue to think about is that, like, if you don't change and you continue to be, on a freight train going towards a wall, inevitably you're going to hit that wall. You got to make that change forward, because it's one of those where as people start seeing the benefits, they go, how can we go back to the old way? How could we use the flashlight? How can we use the handwritten approach? How could we continue to use this guesswork? It is killing our margins, and all of our competitors in the same state are utilizing this, because this is what best practice is in chemical manufacturing.
Yeah, period. Right. I mean, every single pharmaceutical pill you've ever ingested in your life has passed by a type of sensor that measured the API concentration in it.
Well, I think these are the aspects that, as we look to see, which of the teams are going to be pushing forward on their side and getting stronger. I think that, just to recap, specialization for sure is going to be a core aspect. And I think you're going to see a ton of teams kind of figuring out like what they do best. And hopefully they can figure that is, because I think there's a lot of generalists out there, and those companies seem to figure out fast what they do better than everyone else. So I think specialists is the first one. And then the doubling down of sensors and technology from an automation standpoint, I expect that to be like the fundamental talking point for the second half of 2025. And I would expect that to be, if you don't have it in 2026, you don't have a chance to compete. And I think what we've seen from like a car and a horse standpoint is the perfect visualization standpoint of like how teams are currently doing it work to a certain point. But then when they get into the race and they realize all their competitors have cars, how can you possibly compete? Is there any other takeaways that you would say, for the back half of 25?
No, I think that's a good note to end on.
Cool. So if you're looking forward to figuring out what that sensor is, and if you can learn more about how that goes, you can go to Newton Insights. That's NEWTON-INSIGHTS.com, or you hit up Kellen and I. And then finally, thanks so much for listening. And if you guys like this format, or if you want to see something a little different, just let us know. We're out here just kind of freestyling and figuring out how to fill the open space.
Yeah. And just remember to make good choices, everyone.
Thanks, Kellen.